Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, we're going to start where we traditionally start off, and that is near Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and other areas in the eastern Donbass. We continue to see the Russians pushing forward, specifically in and around Bakhmut, continuing its campaign to try and seize control of that relatively small town. The Russians have now penetrated the main defensive line across the Bakhmut River directly to the east of Bakhmut, and are now continuing to threaten the last line of Ukrainian defensive positions along the railway system that runs through the just to the west of the city. The main administrative areas of Bakhmut are now under the control of Russian forces, and now the fighting is centered along the railway centers that divide the very small city. There is also the last bastion of Ukrainian forces, also located in the far western outskirts of town. These are older Soviet-style 3, 4, 5-story buildings on the western outskirts of town that are being used as defensive redoubts by the Ukrainians. Remember, the Ukrainians possess some numerous advanced Western anti-tank guided weapon systems, to include In-Law, Javelin, and undoubtedly those systems are being utilized in this fight. We've seen firsthand accounts of Ukrainian anti-tank guided weapon systems being used actually against troops in the open. So again, they're just not being used. The anti-tank guided weapon systems are not just being used against armored vehicles, but they're also being used against troops as well. So very interesting dynamic of the conflict. And just to the west of Bakhmut, you have units such as the 77th Air Mobile Brigade, along with Special Operations Forces, Ukrainian National Guard forces closer to the front, as well as the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. To the south, near Avdiivka, we continue to see fighting going on in that area as well. We have seen a operation by Ukrainian forces, specifically the 110th Mechanized Brigade. Looks like they have had some success in pushing back Russian forces in this area. Again, would not define it as a breakthrough, but nonetheless, they have committed fairly substantial forces to the north of Avdiivka. Now, what's very interesting to see as the tactics and the strategy change in this conflict, we're starting to see the Russians utilize its air force more and more. We are seeing the Russians deploy 3,000-pound or ton-and-a-half glide bombs. They have taken older bombs. In some cases, they have newer produced bombs as well, and I believe these FAB 1500s that are, again, very large ordnance. And we have seen firsthand accounts of firsthand video footage of these 3,000-pound glide bombs being used in areas such as Volhudar. We have seen these impact strikes of very large ordnance in and around Volhudar that obviously are taking a toll on Ukrainian forces. With that being said, because of the use of these glide munitions, which give Russian aircraft the ability to stay out of the SAM envelope, or the surface-to-air missile envelope of Ukrainian forces. So prior, Russian forces would overfly Ukrainian held territory, and they would be engaged by Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles. Now the Russians are releasing their ordnance many, many miles behind the line of contact. And then these bombs, in some cases, as I just reported, very large bombs, 1.5 tons of explosives, are then gliding onto Ukrainian targets. And that's why you're seeing right now the Ukrainians, for all intents and purposes, they are pleading for a Air Force. Now, are they going to get that Air Force? It's difficult to say. Right now, the West does not seem to be inclined to hand over F-16s or Mirage 2000s or other aircraft to the Ukrainians. And there's a good reason for that, is how would the Ukrainians use those systems? Would the Russians be able to strike at those systems? And in all probability, they would. And it would be all for naught to send a certain amount of F-16s to western Ukraine only to have Russian cruise missiles destroy those systems, which they very well, in all probability, would. Unlike tanks, armored vehicles, HIMARS, anti-tank guided weapon systems that can really be hidden anywhere, the F-16s and aircraft, they have to be deployed to airfields, or they have to operate off of fairly well-maintained existing roadways. And the Russians can use their assets to look down upon those areas to identify the possible deployment of Western F-16s to Western Ukraine, and then they would strike at those targets. So that is why the West is very hesitant about deploying those systems to Ukraine at this point. In other news, you can see now the time lag in terms of getting good information. So we've heard about the Pentagon documents that have been released. It's very speculative in terms of the factual nature of those documents. Were they altered by the Russians? Were they raw documents released by a Pentagon source that gives accurate information? It's difficult to say. And any of that information that has been obtained, it has been released about casualty figures, about the possible deployment of Ukrainian resources, additional Ukrainian brigades, and any sort of offensive operation that may kick off in April. Again, very speculative. But what we do know now is back in October of last year, and we've received enough of these reports now from Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian military personnel, that we believe that it is fairly accurate. And this was a military operation by the Ukrainians with the intent of seizing control of Enerhodar, the nuclear power plant located in this area. Now, allegedly, per Ukrainian sources, this isn't coming from Russian sources, this is Ukrainian sources, that the Ukrainians had compiled a force of about 600 special operations forces from one of their special operations regiments. These are higher tiered light infantry forces that were going to cross the Dnieper River in this area. And it was going to be about 600 Ukrainian special forces coming in on speedboats and other high-performance craft, landing in this area, and then assaulting, conducting a light infantry operation to seize control of Enerhodar, the nuclear power facility in the town just to the east of this locale. Now, the Ukrainians had the support of artillery, HIMARS, other systems, as opposed to the Ukrainians landing tanks and armored infantry fighting vehicles in this area. Now, their initial landings with some of their more higher-end special operations forces, a few dozen, were able to land. And that was the initial assault wave, followed by an additional assault wave that was then intercepted by Russian forces. And the main assault wave, bringing in additional hundreds of Ukrainian special operations forces, were intercepted as they were trying to cross the Dnieper River. So we had pitched battles taking place around the nuclear power facility. We had the use of Ukrainian HIMARS systems in the area as well, trying to target known Russian positions. And then we had the Russians responding with tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and their own artillery and their own Spetsnaz formations against these Ukrainian forces, some of which had landed, some of which had not, and were in the process of trying to cross the Dnieper either in aircraft or again by very fast boats. But from all the reports that we're receiving now from Ukrainian sources, this was not a successful operation. They have not released casualty figures. We do expect those casualties were fairly significant for Ukrainian forces. And that is what led to the calling off of further operations to seize control of the nuclear power facility. But again, this was back in October, and it's taken this long to get this information to really kind of get reported in a fairly accurate way to kind of know and understand what the Ukrainians were trying to do, and it didn't work. Now, obviously, there are numerous other operations that are ongoing, that are happening right now, that have happened, but both sides, again, are being very, very tight-lipped. It's very difficult to get reliable information about what's happening on the ground. And again, we get these leaks that do occur, but again, it's very difficult to look at this information and then dissect this information and then put any kind of validity to this information. Very hard to do that. But again, interesting to see that operation took place near the nuclear power facility. We don't have actual Ukrainian units involved as of yet. Obviously, we may get that at a certain point. But it does appear to be a special operations regiment that was involved in that unsuccessful attempt to seize control of the nuclear power facility. Now, on the other hand, the same goes for the Russian operations near Volhudar. We now know that Russian operation, consisting of essentially a reinforced Russian brigade, did not fare very well. The Russian forces met very heavy resistance outside of Volhudar. A number of armored vehicles were destroyed. I'm not going to say that the entire brigade was destroyed. I'm not going to say that the entire 155th Marine Brigade was destroyed or the 40th Marine Brigade was destroyed. Elements of that Marine Brigade, company-sized elements, were certainly engaged by Ukrainian forces. Anti-tank guided weapon systems from Volhudar, and more importantly, long-range HIMARS systems were also used in that area as well. And remember, another weapon system that the Ukrainians have is the Brimstone and Brimstone 2. An incredibly advanced, very accurate weapon system, far advanced than anything Russia possesses right now. It is one of the most, I would say, advanced weapon systems deployed by Western powers that have been handed over to the Ukrainians. And I'm sure that the Russians are doing everything they can to get their hands on a Brimstone, and in all probability they have. And that should be concerning, because that Brimstone, with that radar system that's on that weapon system, is, again, incredibly advanced. And if the Russians, the Chinese, were to lay their hands on that system and start reverse engineering those systems, not good. Not good at all for Western technology. And again, kind of surprised that we indeed gave or handed over the Brimstone and even the Brimstone 2, or the British handed over the Brimstone 2 to the Ukrainian forces. Same goes with the Challenger 2. Kind of surprised that the Brits would hand over the Challenger 2. I mean, 14 Challenger 2s, you have to look at cost versus benefit. Are the Ukrainians going to be able to do anything with those 14 Challengers? What kind of offensive operations will they be effective with 14 Challengers? Now, on the flip side of that, if the Russians get a hold of Challenger 2, they get a hold of, and they can really analyze the Dorchester armor and those systems on that tank. Now, obviously, I would assume that these Challenger 2s don't have the most up-to-date technology, possibly. Difficult to say. But again, cost versus benefit. Is those 14 Challengers going to benefit the Ukrainians enough where the risk of losing those systems, whether it's PR, political, or even technological, is which is greater? Benefit or the loss? Hard to say at this point. But that's kind of where we sit for today. We'll have more very, very soon. Thanks for joining us. Just before I depart, I will jump over real quick to the Deep State site where we can have a quick another look at what is happening near Bakhmut. Let's go back a little bit, kind of see over the course of the last few days what has happened. And again, you can see that things have really turned for the worse for the Ukrainians in this area. Again, this was contested and now taken by the Russians. And again, very difficult situation for Ukrainian forces. That does it for today. Thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.